One night with his ex-wife changed a successful lawyer's life, a tale of destined romance. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back again to Mr. Peter's Stories. My heart fills with joy seeing both familiar faces and new friends joining our loving family today. A prayer from heart. Dear Heavenly Father, bless our beautiful storytelling family with your divine love. Watch over each precious member, old and new, as we share these magical moments together. Guide our hearts as we embark on another beautiful journey of love. Amen. My family, your happiness with my stories means everything to me. If these tales touch your heart, please share your love in the comments. To our new friends, welcome home. Just open your heart to this story, and I promise you'll fall in love with our wonderful family. Let's begin this magical journey together, filled with love and respect, as we share another beautiful romantic tale that will capture your hearts forever. With endless love, Mr. Peter's Stories family. The neon lights of Angelo's diner flickered against the rain-slicked windows, casting alternating shadows of red and blue across Romilly Bennett's dark skin. Her reflection fragmented in the glass, much like her life had 18 months ago. The night shift dragged on, each minute an echo of her fallen dreams. 3 years of nursing school, 2 years of marriage, and now here she was, starting over at 30, armed with nothing but her pride and a coffee pot that had seen better days. Thunder rolled outside as she methodically wiped down another sticky table, her movements mechanical after 8 hours on her feet. The irony wasn't lost on her that this was the same diner where she'd first met Zale Dawson, rising star of Montgomery & Associates law firm. Back then, she'd been a nursing student working part-time, and he'd been a junior associate with eyes that could melt steel and a smile that made her forget her own name. The memory of their first meeting played in her mind like a worn movie reel. Him rushing in from the rain, case files tucked under his arm, ordering a black coffee with an apologetic smile. She'd been so nervous she'd spilled it all over those precious documents. Instead of anger, he'd laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill every corner of the diner. Guess the judge will have to believe me when I say the evidence was water damaged, he'd joked, helping her mop up the mess. Now, 5 years later, the same ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, its blades cutting through cigarette smoke and forgotten dreams. The vinyl booths were more cracked, the chrome more tarnished, but the memories remained pristine. Every night shift felt like walking through a museum of what could have been. "Table 6 needs coffee," Margot called out from behind the counter, her gravelly voice cutting through Romilly's reverie. The older waitress had been here longer than most of the furniture, her lined face a map of 1,000 late-night stories. She'd been here that first night too, had watched Romilly and Zale's love story unfold between coffee refills and midnight conversations. Romilly grabbed the fresh pot, her wedding ring long gone, but the tan line still faintly visible, a ghost of promises broken. That's when she heard his laugh, rich and familiar, like aged bourbon, carrying the same warmth that had once melted her defenses. Her hands trembled, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the pot's rim. Time seemed to slow as Zale stumbled through the door with his colleagues, their expensive suits and loud voices marking them as celebration crowd from the law firms downtown. They'd obviously been drinking at Maxwell's, the upscale bar 3 blocks over, the same bar where she and Zale had shared their first kiss, hidden in a dark corner booth while rain painted patterns on the windows. His tailored suit was slightly disheveled now, the charcoal grey fabric catching the neon light. His usually pristine black hair was tousled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, an old habit she remembered from late nights when he'd pore over case files in their bed. Their bed. The thought stung like alcohol in an open wound. He hadn't seen her yet, caught up in whatever victory they were celebrating. His success had always been meteoric, his passion for justice matched only by his skill in the courtroom. She'd watched him argue cases with the same intensity he'd once used to convince her to dance with him in their kitchen at midnight. "Another big win for Dawson," one of his colleagues announced to no one in particular, their voices too loud for the quiet diner. The Jenkins case was supposed to be unwinnable. Romley's throat tightened. The Jenkins case. She'd helped him prepare for that one, back when they were still together. Late nights spent quizzing him on precedents, bringing him coffee and encouragement when he doubted himself. She'd believed in him then, believed in them. Before the text messages, before the photos, before Miranda from the firm had shown her evidence of his supposed infidelity that had shattered their world. The group settled into a booth, their old booth, the same one where he'd proposed 2 years ago, getting down on one knee between the salt shaker and the maple syrup. He'd looked so young then, so earnest, promising her forever with trembling hands and steady eyes. "I'll handle that table," Romley told Margot, her voice steadier than her heart. The older waitress's eyes softened with understanding. Everyone here knew their story, had watched it bloom and wither between these walls. 3 years of marriage, 1 devastating betrayal, and 18 months of silence between them. Now here they were, about to share the same air again, breathing in the ghosts of their past, while the neon lights painted everything in shades of what could have been. She grabbed her notepad, each step toward their table feeling like walking through deep water. Time stretched and compressed, memories flooding back with every footfall. Their first date, their first fight, their first makeup kiss. The way he'd looked at her on their wedding day, like she was the only person in the world. The way he'd looked at her the day she left, confusion and desperation warring in those dark eyes she'd once known better than her own. Zale's eyes widened when he saw her, recognition cutting through his drunken haze. The conversation at his table died mid-sentence, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Rome. The old nickname slipped out before he could catch it, and she watched him flinch at his own familiarity. That name belonged to lazy Sunday mornings and whispered promises, not to this sterile space between them. "What can I get you?" Her voice was professional, distant, a waitress's voice, not the voice that had once whispered, "I love you," against his skin, not the voice that had screamed at him to explain the messages, to make her understand how he could throw away everything they'd built. The other lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly very interested in their menus. They all knew her, had attended their wedding, had sent carefully worded condolence emails after the divorce. Now they watched the train wreck in slow motion, uncertain whether to stay or flee. "You're here." Zale leaned forward, his tie loosened, his collar unbuttoned. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just tired. Success had carved new lines around his eyes, or perhaps that was her doing. Working. Orders. She kept her pen poised above the notepad, her shield against the intensity of his gaze. The same gaze that used to make her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world now made her feel exposed, vulnerable. The night progressed with tension, thick enough to cut. His colleagues ordered quickly, making awkward small talk that died as soon as she walked away. But she could feel his eyes following her, burning into her back as she moved between tables. As the hours wore on, his friends left one by one, clapping his shoulder with meaningful looks. Still, he remained, ordering coffee after coffee, watching her with increasingly unfocused eyes. The rain continued outside, painting the windows with memories of other nights, other storms they'd weathered together. Each time she approached his table, the space between them seemed to shrink and expand, heavy with unspoken words and untold truths. The diner slowly emptied as midnight approached, until it was just them, the rain, and 5 years of history hanging in the air. Margot had retreated to the kitchen, leaving them alone in the dining room, surrounded by empty tables and the ghosts of what they'd once been. Romley watched him from behind the counter, remembering how young they'd been, how certain of their love. How could something so solid crumble so completely? How could the man who'd once been her everything become a stranger in a rumpled suit, drinking cold coffee at midnight? The neon lights still flickered, casting their strange shadows. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the drama playing out between these walls. But inside Angelo's diner, time seemed suspended, caught between heartbeats, between what was and what could have been. She glanced at the clock. 15 minutes until closing. 15 minutes to survive this unexpected collision of past and present. 15 minutes before she could retreat to her empty apartment and try to forget the way he still looked at her, like she was both a stranger and the only person he'd ever truly seen. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. One more coffee refill, one more chance to breathe in his familiar scent. One more moment to remember why she'd had to leave, even as every cell in her body screamed to stay. In the distance, thunder rolled, and the neon lights flickered once more, casting their strange spell over this midnight reunion. The night wasn't over yet, and in Angelo's diner, anything could happen between now and dawn. Chapter 2. Liquid Courage. "I'll handle that table," Romley told Margot, her heart thundering against her ribs as she watched Zale struggle with his coffee cup. The older waitress shot her a concerned look, but didn't argue. 3 years of marriage, one devastating betrayal, and 18 months of silence stretched between them like a chasm, yet here they were, sharing the same air in this fluorescent-lit purgatory. The last customer besides Zale had shuffled out 10 minutes ago, leaving behind a half-eaten slice of apple pie and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. Rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, creating a haunting melody that seemed to echo the rhythm of Romley's racing pulse. She approached his table with practiced steps, though each one felt like walking through quicksand. His suit jacket was draped over the back of the booth now, his crisp white shirt wrinkled from a long day of courtroom battles and celebration drinks. The sight of him like this, vulnerable, slightly disheveled, brought back memories of lazy Sunday mornings when he'd read the paper in their kitchen, spectacles perched on his nose, guard completely down. "Your colleagues all left," she said, stating the obvious as she reached for his empty cup. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying her calm exterior. "We're closing soon." Zale's eyes, usually sharp as a lawyer's should be, were slightly unfocused as they tracked her movements. "Rome." The nickname slipped out again, softer this time, less surprised and more yearning. "You look exactly the same." She didn't, really. 18 months had carved subtle changes into both of them, new lines around her eyes, a guarded set to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Her hair was different too. She'd cut off the long curls he used to love running his fingers through, opting instead for a shorter style that required less maintenance and fewer memories. "You're drunk, Zale," she replied, pouring fresh coffee into his cup despite her better judgment. The steam rose between them like the ghosts of everything they'd lost. "Not drunk enough," he murmured, then louder. "Why here? Of all the diners in Atlanta, why come back here?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Why had she come back to Angelo's? The practical answer was simple. They paid better than most diners, and Margot had been kind enough to give her the job without asking too many questions. But the truth was more complicated, wrapped up in memories of first meetings and midnight conversations, of dreams shared over countless cups of coffee. "Some of us don't have the luxury of choosing where we work," she said finally, the words coming out sharper than intended. "We take what we can get after starting over." Zale flinched, as if she'd slapped him. "I looked for you," he said, his words slightly slurred but his gaze intense. After everything. Your phone was disconnected. Your sister wouldn't tell me anything. Even your old nursing colleagues said they hadn't heard from you. That was the point. Romley busied herself wiping down the adjacent table, needing something to do with her hands. Clean breaks heal better. A bitter laugh escaped him. Is that what they taught you in nursing school? Because this doesn't feel healed, Rome. This feels like an open wound that won't stop bleeding. Thunder crashed outside, making her jump. Zale's hand shot out instinctively to steady her, an old habit from when they were together, born from his constant need to protect her. His fingers brushed her wrist for just a moment, but the contact sent electricity racing up her arm. She jerked away as if burned. "Don't," she whispered, but whether she was talking to him or herself, she wasn't sure. "I never thought I'd see you again," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd convinced myself it was better that way, that maybe if I stopped looking, stopped hoping, it would finally stop hurting." He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up further. "But here you are, and it hurts worse than ever." Rain streaked down the windows behind him, creating strange patterns that reminded her of tears. How many nights had she cried herself to sleep after finding those messages? After seeing the photos Miranda had shown her of Zale leaving that hotel, the evidence had seemed so irrefutable then, each piece another nail in the coffin of their marriage. "You lost the right to hurt when you threw us away," she said quietly, stacking sugar packets with mechanical precision. "When you chose her over, I never chose anyone else." His fist came down on the table hard enough to make the coffee cup rattle. "Those messages, those pictures, it wasn't what you thought. If you had just let me explain, you had plenty of chances to explain." The memories flooded back. Him standing in their kitchen, face pale with shock, as she confronted him with the evidence. His desperate attempts to call her after she'd left, the voicemails she'd deleted without listening to them. "You just never had a good enough explanation." Margot poked her head out from the kitchen, concerned by the raised voices, but Romley waved her off with a forced smile. The last thing she needed was an audience for this devastation. "I was set up," Zale said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Miranda, she wanted my position at the firm, the partnership track. She orchestrated everything, the messages, the photos, all of it. I tried to prove it, but by the time I had evidence, you were gone." The words hit her like ice water. Miranda Wallace, the ambitious junior associate who'd shown her the damning evidence in the first place. The woman who'd seemed so sympathetic, so concerned about Romley's well-being. Could it have all been a lie? "You're drunk," she repeated, but the words lacked conviction. "You don't know what you're saying." "Drunk enough to finally tell the truth," he admitted, reaching for her hand across the table. This time she didn't pull away. His fingers were warm against hers, familiar in a way that made her heart ache. "I never cheated, Rome, never even looked at another woman. You were everything to me. You still are." Outside, the storm intensified. Rain, hammering against the roof like nature itself, was trying to break through. The neon lights flickered once, twice, casting strange shadows across Zale's face. He looked younger suddenly, more like the earnest young lawyer who'd first walked into this diner 5 years ago. "I see you," he continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Every time I drive past this place, I look for you. Sometimes I imagine you're here, wearing that same blue uniform, smiling that smile that made me spill my coffee the first time we met, but you never were, until tonight. Zale." His name felt like a prayer on her lips, or maybe a warning. "I took the Jenkins case because the client couldn't afford anyone else," he said, the words tumbling out now as if he couldn't hold them back. "Just like you always said I should, using my skills to help people, not just chase money. Every victory, every case, I wanted to tell you first. You were always my best confidant, my biggest supporter." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. How many nights had she imagined a different explanation for what happened? How many times had she almost called him, almost given him a chance to defend himself? But pride and pain had held her back, convinced her that the evidence couldn't lie. "I can't trust this," she whispered, but her hand remained in his. "You're drunk, emotional. Tomorrow you'll regret saying all this. The only thing I regret is not fighting harder for you." His eyes met hers, and despite the alcohol, they were clear and determined. "For us, I let you walk away because I thought if you believed I could betray you like that, maybe we weren't as strong as I thought we were. But I was wrong. I should have followed you, should have made you listen." The last customer's abandoned apple pie sat untouched on the counter, a silent witness to this midnight confession. Through the kitchen door, she could hear Margot cleaning up, the familiar sounds of closing time providing a strange soundtrack to this surreal moment. "Let me drive you home," she heard herself say, the words surprising them both. "You shouldn't be behind the wheel like this." Relief flooded his features. "Still taking care of everyone else," he murmured, his free hand coming up to brush a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "That's why I loved you, love you, never stopped." The touch of his fingers on her cheek was achingly familiar, sending shivers down her spine. 18 months of carefully constructed walls were crumbling, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to rebuild them or let them fall. "You're drunk, Zale," she said again. But this time, it wasn't an accusation, more like a reminder to herself of why she shouldn't let her guard down. "Drunk enough to finally tell the truth," he repeated, standing up somewhat unsteadily. His height had always made her feel protected, not intimidated. Even now, her body remembered how perfectly they fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that had been forcibly separated. As she helped him with his jacket, his cologne, the same brand he'd always worn, enveloped her, bringing with it a flood of memories. Their first kiss in the rain outside Maxwell's, the way he'd held her through her father's funeral, dancing in their kitchen at midnight, his case files forgotten on the counter. "Where are your keys?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional storm raging inside her. "Don't need them," he mumbled, leaning slightly against her as they made their way to the door. "Came in Thomas's car. He was supposed to be the designated driver, but he'd left hours ago like all the others, leaving Zale alone with his coffee and confessions. Whether by accident or design, they were now the only two people in the world, watched only by the neon lights and the relentless rain. "I'll call you a cab," she said, reaching for her phone, but his hand caught hers again. "Please," he whispered, and that one word contained a universe of meaning. "Please, trust me. Please believe me. Please don't send me away again." The storm raged on outside as Romley stood on the precipice of a decision that could change everything again. Lightning flashed, illuminating Zale's face, the face she'd loved, lost, and tried so hard to forget. In that brief, brilliant moment, she saw everything, the pain, the longing, the desperate hope in his eyes. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, between one crack of thunder and another, she made her choice. Chapter 3. One night's mistake. "You shouldn't drive," Romley said at closing time, watching Zale struggle with his keys in the rain-slicked parking lot. Water dripped from his disheveled hair, his expensive suit darkening with each passing second. "I'll call you a cab." The neon lights of Angelo's diner cast a surreal glow through the downpour, painting everything in shades of red and blue. Lightning split the sky, illuminating their faces in stark relief. Two people who had once known every secret, every dream, every fear the other possessed, now standing as strangers in a storm. "Always taking care of everyone else," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. His hand reached out to brush a raindrop from her cheek, but they both knew it wasn't rain at all. "That's why I loved you, love you, never stopped." "You're drunk, Zale." The words came automatically, a shield against the vulnerability in his eyes. Drunk enough to finally tell the truth. I never cheated, Rome. His fingers lingered on her skin, warm despite the cold rain. Those messages. Miranda set me up, wanted my position at the firm. I should have fought harder to prove it, should have made you listen. Thunder rolled overhead, drowning out the sound of her heart breaking all over again. The parking lot was empty, except for her ancient Honda and his colleague's borrowed car. The world had narrowed to just this moment, just them, suspended between what was and what could be. "Let me drive you home," she heard herself say, the keys to her car already in her hand. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake, that she was opening herself up to more pain. But 18 months of carefully constructed walls were crumbling in the face of his raw honesty and the lingering scent of his cologne, the same brand he'd worn since they first met. He nodded, following her to the car with unsteady steps. The rain intensified, driving sheets of water that seemed determined to wash away their pretenses along with their defenses. She helped him into the passenger seat, trying to ignore how natural it felt to take care of him again. The interior of her car still smelled faintly of vanilla. Her signature scent, that he used to say, reminded him of Sunday mornings and fresh coffee. As she slid behind the wheel, memories flooded back. Countless drives with his hand on her knee, singing along to old soul music, planning their future between red lights and stop signs. "Your address still the same?" she asked, starting the engine. The windshield wipers created a hypnotic rhythm, matching the thunder of her pulse. "Couldn't leave," he admitted, his head resting against the window. "Kept hoping you'd come back." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. She pulled out of the parking lot, muscle memory guiding her toward their old neighborhood. No, his neighborhood now. The streets were nearly empty, the storm having driven everyone else indoors. "I thought about it," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Coming back. Some nights I'd drive by your house just to see if the lights were on." His hand found hers on the gear shift, fingers intertwining as if the past 18 months had never happened. "Why didn't you?" Pride, maybe, or fear. She didn't pull away, letting the warmth of his touch anchor her in the storm. The evidence seemed so convincing. The messages, the photos Miranda showed me. Miranda. He spat the name like poison. She played us both, created fake messages, hired someone to take those photos outside the hotel. I was there for a deposition. She knew that, used it against us. His grip tightened on her hand. "By the time I figured it out, proved what she'd done, you were gone. Phone disconnected. Family wouldn't tell me anything." Lightning illuminated the city skyline, the familiar buildings where they'd built their life together. The law firm where he worked was visible in the distance, its windows dark except for the cleaning crew. How many nights had she waited up for him to come home from that building, proud of his dedication but missing his presence. "Turn here," he said suddenly as they approached his street. But instead of his house, he directed her to the Harbor View Hotel, the same upscale establishment where they'd spent their wedding night. Zale. His name was both question and warning. "Please," he whispered, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I can't go home tonight, not to that empty house, not with you finally here." The hotel loomed before them, its elegant facade a stark contrast to the storm raging around it. Romley put the car in park, her mind racing with all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But when she turned to tell him so, the look in his eyes stole her breath away. "One night," he said, his voice rough with need and something deeper, desperation maybe, or hope. "One night to tell you everything, to make you understand. After that, if you still want to walk away." She should say no. Should drive him home and leave him there with his drunk confessions and rain-soaked regrets. but 18 months of loneliness and unanswered questions weighed heavily on her soul. "The bar's still open," she found herself saying. "We can talk there." But they never made it to the bar. The elevator ride to his hastily booked room was silent, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Their shoulders brushed with each floor, sending sparks of awareness through her body. His cologne mixed with the scent of rain and leather, creating an intoxicating combination that made her head spin. Room 1542, the same floor where they'd spent their wedding night, though a different room. Zale's hands shook as he swiped the keycard, and Romley wondered if it was the alcohol or anticipation that made them tremble. The room was dark when they entered, city lights filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Neither of them moved to turn on the lights. Sometimes truths were easier to speak in darkness. "I never took off my ring," he said into the shadows, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Keep it in my pocket every day. Pathetic, right?" Romley's hand went to her own bare finger, where the tan line was finally starting to fade. "Not pathetic," she whispered. "Human." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I miss you every day. Miss your laugh, your smile, the way you'd fall asleep reading medical journals. Miss the way you'd leave little notes in my case files. Remember to eat. You've got this. I believe in you." "Zale." Her voice broke on his name. "Tell me you don't miss us too," he challenged, his hand coming up to cup her face. "Tell me you don't think about what we had, what we could still have." Instead of answering, she kissed him. The first touch of their lips was electric, 18 months of longing and hurt and love pouring out in a single moment. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer as if afraid she'd disappear again. She tangled her fingers in his damp hair, remembering how it felt to be loved by him, to be cherished. Thunder crashed outside, but neither of them noticed. The world had narrowed to just this, the taste of whiskey and coffee on his lips, the familiar strength of his arms around her, the way their bodies remembered each other even after all this time. "I'm sorry," he whispered between kisses, his words painting apologies across her skin. "So sorry I didn't fight harder, didn't make you listen, didn't prove the truth sooner." "I'm sorry too," she breathed, letting him pull her toward the bed. "Sorry I didn't trust you enough to stay and listen. Sorry I let her come between us." Their clothes left a trail from door to bed. His rain-soaked suit, her diner uniform, physical representations of the barriers between them falling away. Each touch was both familiar and new, rediscovering territory that had once been as known as their own hearts. Lightning illuminated the room in sporadic bursts, catching glimpses of their reunion like photographs. His hands tracing the curve of her spine, her lips pressed against his throat, their fingers intertwined against the sheets. The storm provided a soundtrack to their reconciliation, nature's fury matching their own desperate passion. Hours later, as the storm began to fade and false dawn painted the sky in shades of grey, Romley lay in his arms, listening to his heartbeat. The steady rhythm reminded her of countless nights spent just like this, planning their future between kisses and whispered dreams. "Stay," he murmured into her hair, his arms tightening around her. "Not just tonight. Come home." Reality began to seep back in with the approaching dawn. One night of passion, no matter how intense, couldn't erase 18 months of pain and misunderstanding. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt in a single storm. "It's not that simple," she whispered, though every cell in her body screamed to accept, to believe, to trust again. "It could be." His fingers traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "Let me prove it to you. Let me show you the evidence against Miranda. Let me earn your trust back, day by day." The city was beginning to wake outside their window, the first hints of sunrise painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Soon, the spell would be broken, reality would reassert itself, and they'd have to face the consequences of this night. But for now, Romley allowed herself to believe in second chances, in the possibility of rebuilding what they'd lost, in the truth she saw in his eyes. She lifted her head to kiss him one more time, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture. Morning would bring clarity for better or worse. But this night belonged to them, to healing, to the hope that sometimes love was stronger than pride, stronger than pain, stronger than 18 months of silence. Outside, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world washed clean and ready for new beginnings. Chapter 4. The morning after sunlight filtered through unfamiliar curtains, painting golden patterns across rumpled sheets. Romley woke slowly, her body heavy with the pleasant ache of reunion. For a moment she let herself believe it was 5 years ago, just another morning waking up beside her husband, planning their day over coffee and stolen kisses. But reality crept in with the morning light. This wasn't their bed, their home, their life together. This was room 1542 at the Harborview Hotel, and last night had changed everything. Zale slept peacefully beside her, his face softer in sleep, years younger without the weight of their separation etched in his features. His arm was still draped protectively across her waist, as if even in sleep he was afraid she'd disappear again. The familiar sight made her heart clench with a mixture of love and fear. His words from last night echoed in her mind. Miranda set me up, wanted my position at the firm. Could it be true? The evidence had seemed so irrefutable 18 months ago. The text messages, the photos of him leaving that hotel with another woman, the timestamps that matched his late nights at the office. But now, in the harsh light of morning, doubt crept in. Miranda had been the one to show her everything, had been the shoulder she cried on, the voice urging her to leave before she got hurt worse. Miranda, who had subsequently taken Zale's place on the partnership track when he'd spent months distracted by their divorce. Romley slipped out of bed carefully, gathering her scattered clothes from the floor. Her diner uniform was wrinkled beyond saving, but she pulled it on anyway, needing its familiar armor against the vulnerability of the moment. In the bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her short curls were tousled from sleep, and Zale's fingers, her lips still slightly swollen from his kisses. Dark eyes stared back at her, filled with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. What happened now? Could they really rebuild from the ashes of their marriage? Trust, once broken, was like a shattered mirror. You could piece it back together, but the cracks would always show. The sound of shifting sheets from the other room made her freeze. Was he awake? What would she say to him in the light of day? Last night had been a storm of emotion and need, years of longing breaking free in a flood of passion. But morning brought clarity, and with it, fear. She thought of her tiny apartment, filled with second-hand furniture and carefully constructed routines. No photos on the walls, no memories to haunt her. She'd rebuilt her life piece by piece after leaving him, each day a conscious choice to move forward rather than look back. But looking back was all she'd done since seeing him at the diner last night. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered apology had pulled her deeper into the past they shared, the future they'd planned. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Margot asking if she was okay after last night's drama at the diner. The real world was creeping in, reminding her that decisions made in the heat of passion had consequences in the cold light of day. Through the bathroom door, she heard Zale stirring. The rustle of sheets, a soft groan as he woke. Would he regret last night? The alcohol had worn off hours ago, but sometimes morning brought different kinds of clarity. She should leave. Slip out before he fully woke, preserve what was left of her carefully constructed walls. But her feet wouldn't move, frozen between flight and the magnetic pull of the man in the other room. Rome. His voice was rough with sleep, concerned. He'd noticed her absence already. Her hands gripped the edge of the bathroom counter, knuckles white with tension. One night couldn't erase 18 months of pain. One confession couldn't rebuild trust destroyed by lies, or what she'd thought were lies. The memory of their last morning together flashed through her mind. Him rushing to work, distracted by some big case, her finding those messages on his phone when it buzzed after he left. The spiral of discovery that followed, each piece of evidence Miranda presented, fitting perfectly into a puzzle she'd never wanted to solve. But what if the puzzle pieces had been forced to fit? What if Miranda, with her ambitious smile and sympathetic eyes, had orchestrated the whole thing? Romely? Closer now, worry evident in his voice. Are you all right? She stared at her reflection again, at the woman she'd become in the 18 months since leaving him. Stronger, more independent, but also more guarded. The walls she'd built weren't just to keep him out. They were to keep herself from hoping, from believing, from risking her heart again. His footsteps approached the bathroom door, and she could see his shadow under it. One touch of the handle would bring them face to face, force her to confront the choices that lay ahead. But she couldn't do it. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain what was truth and what was lies, what was real and what was merely the ghost of their past, refusing to rest. She opened the door before he could, catching him mid-reach for the handle. He stood there in just his dress pants from last night, hair mussed from sleep and her fingers, eyes filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Don't," she said softly, stepping past him. "Please don't say anything." "Rome, wait!" He reached for her, but she evaded his grasp. "I need time," she said, gathering her purse from where it had fallen near the door. "Last night was perfect," he finished when she trailed off. "It was perfect, and you know it." She closed her eyes against the truth in his words. It was a mistake. The hurt that flashed across his face felt like a physical blow. "You don't mean that." "I don't know what I mean anymore." Her hand found the door handle, cool metal grounding her in reality. "You can't just tell me everything I believed for 18 months was a lie and expect me to what? To trust me? To believe in us again?" He stepped closer, and it took everything in her not to lean into his warmth. "I can prove it, Rome. Let me show you the evidence against Miranda. Let me—" "I can't." The words came out choked. "Not right now. I need to think." His cologne still clung to her skin, a sensory reminder of every kiss, every touch, every whispered apology exchanged in the darkness. She'd have to shower 3 times to get rid of it, and part of her didn't want to. "At least let me drive you home," he pleaded. "Your car's still at the diner." The diner. Where this had all started, both 5 years ago and last night. Where she'd have to return for her evening shift, carrying these new memories like secret wounds. "I'll call a cab." She opened the door, letting the sterile hotel hallway air rush in. "Please don't follow me." "I won't lose you again," he said to her back as she stepped into the hallway. "I let you walk away once without fighting for us. I won't make that mistake again." She paused, one hand on the doorframe. Maybe the mistake was thinking we could fix 18 months of hurt with one night of passion. It wasn't just passion, and you know it. His voice was rough with emotion. It was truth. It was us, finding our way back to each other. A housekeeping cart rattled by, the mundane sound jarring against the intensity of the moment. The maid gave them a curious look, him shirtless in the doorway, her in a wrinkled uniform at dawn. Another snippet of gossip for the hotel staff break room. "Goodbye, Zale." She forced herself to walk away, each step feeling like lead. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see if he was watching her go. Again. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that felt like mockery. As she stepped inside, her reflection in the mirrored walls showed a woman on the edge of either breakdown or breakthrough. She wasn't sure which. The lobby was starting to fill with early morning business travelers, their pressed suits and purposeful strides a stark contrast to her disheveled state. She hurried through them like a ghost, leaving only her lingering scent of vanilla and regret. Outside, the world was washed clean by last night's storm. Puddles reflected the rising sun, and the air held that peculiar freshness that comes after rain. Her phone buzzed again. Margot, probably wondering if she'd still make her evening shift. She walked 3 blocks before calling a cab, needing the physical distance as much as the emotional space. Each step took her further from room 1542, from the truth in Zale's eyes, from the possibility of healing what had been broken. But his scent followed her home, clung to her skin as she stripped off her uniform, haunted her as she finally let the tears fall in the safety of her shower. The water couldn't wash away the memory of his touch, his taste, his whispered confessions in the dark. Later, she would have to face the questions about Miranda's possible betrayal, about 18 months of believing lies, about whether love was enough to rebuild trust shattered by deception. Later, she would have to decide if she was brave enough to risk her heart again. But for now, she left only her lingering scent on the pillows in room 1542, and the echo of possibility in the space between what was and what could be. Chapter 5. Unexpected news. 6 weeks could change everything. Romley sat on the cold tile of her tiny apartment bathroom, staring at the 3rd pregnancy test she'd taken that morning. 2 pink lines appeared with unwavering certainty, just like the previous 2. Her hands shook as she placed it beside the others on the counter, creating a lineup of life-altering confirmation. The morning sun filtered through the frosted window, casting shadows that danced across the tests like nature's own tally marks. One night, one moment of weakness, or perhaps strength. And now everything was about to change again. She pressed her hands against her still, flat stomach, trying to comprehend the reality that life was growing inside her. Their life, hers and Zale's. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her body. The past 6 weeks had been a dance of avoidance. She'd switched her shifts at the diner to mornings, knowing Zale only came in during the evening. She'd ignored his calls, deleted his messages unread, tried to pretend that night at the Harbor View Hotel had been nothing more than a dream. But her body had other plans. The first signs had been subtle. Fatigue that coffee couldn't cure, certain smells from the diner's kitchen sending her rushing to the bathroom, her uniform feeling slightly tighter around her breasts. She'd attributed it all to stress until her period was late. Now, there was no more denying it, no more hiding from the truth that had been growing inside her for weeks. Rising from the floor on shaky legs, Romley caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow. Though logically she knew it was too early for any physical changes to show. Maybe it was in her eyes, the knowledge that she was no longer just herself, but the vessel for something more. The cheap drugstore tests felt inadequate for news of this magnitude. She needed to see a doctor, needed confirmation beyond these plastic sticks with their life-changing lines, but that would make it real in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. Her phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. For a moment, she thought it might be Zale, somehow knowing, somehow sensing the monumental shift in their shared universe. But the number was unknown, and the message that appeared made her blood run cold. "Ms. Bennett, this is Miranda Wallace. We need to talk about Zale and what really happened 3 years ago." Romley's legs gave out, and she sank back down to the bathroom floor. Miranda. The name alone brought back a flood of memories. Sympathetic smiles hiding viper's teeth, evidence presented with just the right mix of reluctance and concern, a shoulder to cry on that had guided her straight out of her marriage. The phone buzzed again. I'm being disbarred. What I did to you and Zale, you deserve to know the truth. Please meet me." Time seemed to stand still in the small bathroom. The morning light continued its slow dance across the tiles, indifferent to the way Romilly's world was tilting on its axis. One hand pressed against her stomach, the other clutching her phone like a lifeline, or perhaps a poison pill. She thought of that night 6 weeks ago, of Zale's desperate insistence that Miranda had set him up. At the time, clouded by passion and years of hurt, she hadn't fully processed his words. But now, "I have proof," the next message read. "Documents, recordings, everything that shows how I orchestrated your separation. You both deserve to know." The irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. Just as one truth was making itself known through undeniable physical evidence, another truth was threatening to unravel everything she'd believed for the past 18 months. Her morning sickness chose that moment to reassert itself, and she found herself clutching the toilet bowl, heaving up what little breakfast she'd managed to eat. The physical purge felt almost symbolic, her body rejecting old lies along with her morning toast. When the nausea passed, she rinsed her mouth and stared at her reflection again. The woman who looked back at her was simultaneously stronger and more vulnerable than she'd ever been. She was no longer just making decisions for herself. Her phone buzzed one final time. "I'm at my office now. Security is clearing out my things. This might be your only chance to hear the whole truth." The mundane sounds of her apartment complex filtered through the bathroom window. Children leaving for school, cars starting, life continuing its normal rhythm while her world shifted on its foundation. She had choices to make, truths to face, futures to consider. Mechanically, she began to get dressed. Her diner uniform hung on the back of her bedroom door, but she passed it by. She wouldn't be making her shift today. Some things were more important than perfect attendance. The pregnancy tests went into her purse, physical proof of how one night could change everything. Her hands trembled as she gathered her keys, her phone, her dignity. The drive to Montgomery and Associates felt like traveling through time. How many mornings had she made this same journey to bring Zale lunch, to surprise him with coffee, to share good news about her nursing program? The building hadn't changed, but she had. They all had. The security guard recognized her despite the 18-month absence. "Mrs. Dawson?" he said, then caught himself. "Miss Bennett, sorry. Is Miranda Wallace still here?" The name tasted bitter on her tongue. 15th floor. Better hurry, they're just about done clearing her office." The elevator ride gave her too much time to think. Her hand kept straying to her stomach, this new secret making her hyper-aware of every movement, every sensation. What would Zale say when he found out? Would this news bring them together or drive them further apart? The 15th floor was chaos. Cardboard boxes lined the halls, papers scattered across previously pristine carpets. The name Miranda Wallace, junior partner, was being scraped off a door by a maintenance worker. And there she was. Miranda looked nothing like the polished predator who had destroyed Romilly's marriage. Her designer suit was wrinkled, her perfectly straight hair disheveled, her mascara smudged from what might have been tears. She was supervising the packing of her office with the air of someone attending their own funeral. Miranda. The other woman spun at the sound of Romilly's voice, nearly dropping the frame she was holding. It was a photo from the firm's charity gala, Miranda accepting an award while Zale applauded in the background. The same gala where she'd first begun her campaign of destruction. "You came." Relief flooded Miranda's features. "I wasn't sure you would. Start talking." Romilly's voice was steadier than she felt, one hand unconsciously protective over her stomach. Miranda's eyes caught the movement, widening slightly before she schooled her features. "Not here. There's a coffee shop around the corner." "No coffee." The words came out sharper than intended, her morning sickness making the mere thought of coffee unbearable. "Just tell me what you did." "All of it." The maintenance worker finished with the door, leaving them alone in the debris of Miranda's career. She sank into her desk chair one last time, gesturing for Romley to take the visitor's seat. "It was supposed to be me," Miranda began, her voice hollow. "The partnership track. I had seniority, better case records, everything. But Zale, he had that special something. The partners loved him, especially after you came along." "What do you mean?" "He was different after he met you. Happier, more focused, started taking pro bono cases, making connections with clients on a personal level, the kind of lawyer people trust, not just respect." She laughed bitterly. "The kind of lawyer who makes partner." Romley remembered those days, Zale coming home excited about helping people, not just winning cases. The way he'd light up talking about making a difference, not just making money. "So you destroyed our marriage to get ahead." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I had help." Miranda pulled a USB drive from her desk drawer. "Another associate, James Chen. He's brilliant with computers, the text messages, the photos. We planned everything, timed it perfectly with the legitimate deposition Zale had at that hotel. Hired a woman who looked just similar enough in the pictures to raise doubts. Each word was a blow, confirming Zale's drunk confessions from that night 6 weeks ago." Romley's hand tightened on her stomach, this new life becoming an anchor in the storm of revelations. "Why confess now?" Miranda's laugh was hollow. "Because James got sloppy. Used the same techniques to fake evidence in the Harriman case. When it all came out, well, they started digging. Found everything." She pushed the USB drive across the desk. "It's all here. The original photos before editing, the fake phone records, emails between James and me planning everything, even recordings of our conversations where we..." She swallowed hard. "Where we celebrated when you left him." Romley stared at the small device that contained proof of how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. "Did you ever feel guilty?" "Every time you cried on my shoulder." Miranda's voice cracked. "Every time you thanked me for being there for you, but by then it was too late. The lie was too big, and the partnership was almost mine. And now I'm being disbarred. James too, once the ethics committee finishes their investigation. Seems fitting, doesn't it? We destroyed your marriage for my career, and in the end, I lost everything anyway." Romley stood, the reality of her current situation making it impossible to stay still. This woman had orchestrated the worst pain of her life, had played her like a puppet, had cost her 18 months with the man she loved, the man whose child she now carried. "The worst part," Miranda continued, apparently needing to confess everything, "was watching him after you left. He was like a ghost, threw himself into work but lost that spark that made him special. The partners noticed too, started having doubts about the partnership track. That's the only reason I got it instead of someone else." "You didn't just hurt me," Romley said quietly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You hurt him, used our love against us, played with our lives like they were pieces on a chessboard." "I know." Miranda's mascara was definitely running now. "That's why I had to tell you, before they escort me out of the building for good, because he never cheated, never even looked at another woman. He loved you, still loves you." The baby chose that moment to make its presence known with another wave of nausea. Romley pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting it back through sheer will. "Are you..." Miranda's eyes widened with understanding. Oh God, that night at the Harbor View, when he didn't come in to work the next day. "This meeting is over." Romley grabbed the USB drive, needing to escape before her body betrayed her further. "Wait," Miranda called after her. "What are you going to do?" Romley paused in the doorway, looking back at the wreckage of Miranda's office. cardboard boxes and karma, creating a fitting end to her schemes. "I'm going to do what you never had the courage to do," she said quietly. "I'm going to tell the truth." Chapter 6. Hidden Truths. The morning sun cast long shadows through the glass walls of Montgomery and Associates as Romley stepped into Miranda Wallace's corner office. The space reeked of defeat, cardboard boxes scattered across Italian marble floors, designer suits stuffed carelessly into garment bags, legal awards being wrapped in newspaper. The mighty had fallen, and fallen hard. Miranda herself stood by the window, her usual power suit replaced by wrinkled silk, her perfect hair showing signs of sleepless nights. When she turned, her mascara-stained eyes widened at the sight of Romley. "You actually came." Relief and fear mingled in her voice. She gestured to a chair that probably cost more than Romley's monthly rent. "Please sit." "I'll stand." Romley's hand instinctively covered her still flat stomach, protecting the secret growing within. "You said you have proof about what really happened 3 years ago." Miranda's laugh was hollow, echoing off the emptying walls. "Proof? I have more than proof. I have a confession." She pulled open a drawer, removing a leather portfolio. "Everything's here, every lie, every manipulation, every calculated move to destroy your marriage." The portfolio landed on the desk between them with a heavy thud. Inside, Romley found photos, dozens of them. The originals showing Zale alone outside the hotel, then the doctored versions with the mysterious woman added. Text message logs showing how they'd recreated Zale's typing patterns. Email chains between Miranda and James Chen plotting every detail. "It was supposed to be perfect," Miranda said, watching Romley's face as each revelation hit home. "I'd spent years building my career, making all the right moves." Then Zale walks in, fresh out of law school, with his idealistic dreams and his perfect marriage, and suddenly he's on the fast track to partnership. Her voice cracked on the last word. She reached for a crystal decanter, pouring amber liquid into a glass with trembling hands. "One? No, of course not. Not in your condition." Romley's head snapped up. "How did you—" "Please." Miranda's smile was bitter. "You're glowing. And you haven't touched the coffee I offered. How far along? That's none of your business." "No, I suppose not. Nothing in your lives should have been my business." She drained her glass. "But I made it my business, spent months studying you both, learning your patterns, your vulnerabilities, your weak spots." She pulled out another file. "Did you know Zale turned down Carter and Myers after your separation? Prestigious firm, double his salary, corner office, but their building didn't overlook Angelo's diner. He couldn't bear the thought of not being able to look for you every day." Each word was a knife to Romley's heart. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm being disbarred anyway." Miranda's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Might as well make a clean breast of it. James got sloppy with evidence in another case, and when they started investigating—" She gestured at the boxes. "Well, you can see how that turned out." She moved to a painting on the wall, removing it to reveal a safe. "The thing about being a good liar? You learn to keep insurance." The safe opened with a soft click. "Every piece of evidence showing how we destroyed your marriage, every recording of our planning sessions, even the receipt from the actress we hired to walk past the hotel." "Actress? Did you think we'd leave something like that to chance? No, everything was choreographed. The woman in those photos, a struggling actress named Claire, paid her $5,000 to walk past the hotel 3 times while our photographer happened to be there." The room spun slightly. Romley gripped the back of a chair, her morning sickness intensified by each new revelation. "You look pale," Miranda observed. "Here." She pulled a USB drive from the safe. "Everything's on this. The original photos, the fake text messages, the emails between James and me, even video of us celebrating when you left him." The drive felt impossibly heavy in Romley's hand. Did you ever feel guilty? Every damn day. Miranda's composure cracked. Every time you cried on my shoulder, every time you thanked me for being there for you, every time I watched Zale die a little more inside. She poured another drink with shaking hands. But by then, it was too late. The lie was too big, and the partnership was almost mine. And now? She gestured at her crumbling empire. Now, I'm being disbarred. James, too, once the ethics committee finishes their investigation. Calm as a bitch, isn't it? We destroyed your marriage for my career, and in the end, I lost everything anyway. Romley moved to leave, the USB drive burning in her hand. But Miranda's next words stopped her cold. He hired private investigators, you know, spent a fortune trying to find you, prove his innocence, nearly got himself disbarred trying to subpoena phone records that would show the messages were fake. She pulled out one final file. The night you served him divorce papers, he sat in his office for 3 days straight. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. Just stared at your wedding photo and tried to figure out where it all went wrong. The nausea returned with vengeance. Romley barely made it to Miranda's private bathroom, emptying her stomach into the marble toilet. When she emerged, pale but composed, Miranda was holding out a bottle of water. The Harbor View Hotel, Miranda said quietly. That night, 6 weeks ago. That's when... She gestured vaguely at Romley's midsection. That's none of your business. No, it's not. Nothing about your lives should have been my business. Miranda's smile was sad. But maybe this is how it was supposed to end. My career destroyed, your family restored, a kind of cosmic justice. She held out a final envelope. One more thing you should see. Security footage from that hotel, the day of the deposition. Proof that Zale was alone, that the woman in those photos never existed. I kept it as insurance against James trying to blame everything on me. Romley took the envelope, but didn't open it. She had all the proof she needed, in the USB drive, in the files, in her memories of Zale's desperate attempts to explain, and in the tiny lives growing inside her, proof that love could survive any lie, any manipulation, any attempt to destroy it. Goodbye, Miranda. She turned to leave, then paused. I hope it was worth it. It wasn't. Miranda's voice was barely a whisper. None of it was. Romley walked out of the office for the last time, carrying evidence of the past and hope for the future. The morning sickness had passed, leaving behind a strange clarity. She had choices to make, truths to face, and a future to build. But first, she had a call to make. It was time Zale knew everything. About the babies, about Miranda's confession, about the truth that had finally broken free after 18 months of lies. The elevator doors closed on Miranda's empire, but opened onto Romley's new beginning. Sometimes, she realized, you had to face the darkest truths to find your way back to light. Chapter 7. Confrontation. You're avoiding me. Zale cornered her at the diner 2 weeks after Miranda's confession. The morning rush had just ended, leaving them in that quiet lull between breakfast and lunch. Romley's hands trembled as she refilled the sugar dispensers, hyper-aware of his presence behind her. She'd spent the past 14 days processing everything: Miranda's confession, the evidence of their manipulation, the growing certainty of the life inside her. Her doctor had confirmed what the home tests had already told her. She was carrying Zale's child. The ultrasound had revealed an even bigger surprise: twins. I'm working, she said, not turning around. The morning sickness had been brutal today, and just the smell of coffee was threatening to send her running for the bathroom again. 2 weeks, Rome. His voice was low, intense. 2 weeks since Miranda's confession came out. You won't take my calls, won't answer my messages. I know you have the proof now. Everything I tried to tell you that night at the Harbor View. The mention of that night made her stomach flip. though this time it wasn't morning sickness. Memories flooded back, desperate kisses, whispered truths, passion that had created the lives now growing inside her. That night meant something, he continued, moving closer. She could smell his cologne, the same brand he'd always worn, the scent that still clung to her dreams. You can't deny that. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. The coffee pot slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor in a spray of glass and dark liquid. The crash seemed to echo through the diner, matching the thundering of her heart. Time seemed to stop. Coffee spread across the linoleum like a dark tide, seeping into her sensible shoes, but neither of them moved. Zale stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and something else, hope, maybe, or fear. "Pregnant," he repeated, the word coming out like a prayer. His eyes dropped to her stomach, still flat under her uniform. "How? When? The harbor view." Her voice was barely a whisper. "That night." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by a storm of emotions she couldn't quite read. His hand reached out, hovering over her still flat abdomen before dropping back to his side. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" The hurt in his voice was palpable. "I needed time." Her hands shook as she grabbed a rag to clean up the spilled coffee. To process everything. Miranda's confession, the proof of what really happened, and now this. He caught her wrist before she could kneel to clean the mess, pulling her away from the broken glass. "Let me help." "I don't need—" "Yes, you do." His voice was firm but gentle. "You're carrying my child. Our child. You shouldn't be around broken glass and chemical cleaners." "Children," she corrected softly. "Twins." The word hit him like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, gripping the counter for support. "Twins?" Margot appeared from the kitchen, taking in the scene, the broken coffee pot, the spreading puddle, the tension between them. "Take your break, Romley," she said, already reaching for the mop. "Back booth, I'll bring you some ginger tea." Zale guided her to their old booth, his hand hovering protectively near her elbow. The same booth where they'd first fallen in love, where he'd proposed, where everything had begun. Now it would be where they faced this new beginning, or ending. "Twins," he said again as they sat, testing the word. "How far along?" 8 weeks. She pulled the ultrasound photo from her apron pocket, sliding it across the table. She'd been carrying it for days, waiting for this moment, dreading it and longing for it in equal measure. His hands trembled as he picked up the image. 2 tiny shapes, barely more than blurs, but unmistakably there. Their children. His finger traced the outline of each one, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I've missed so much already," he whispered. "The tests, the first doctor's visit, the ultrasound. I only found out 2 weeks ago." She accepted the ginger tea Margot silently delivered, grateful for the warmth between her palms. The same day Miranda confessed everything. Talk about life-changing days. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "Why didn't you come to me then, when you saw the proof that I never betrayed you?" "Because I betrayed you." The words burned coming out, but they needed to be said. "I believed the worst of you. Didn't give you a chance to explain, let Miranda manipulate me into throwing away everything we had. We were both manipulated." His hand inched across the table, not quite touching hers. "She spent months planning it, studying our weaknesses, learning exactly how to break us apart. But I should have trusted you." The tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over. "Should have known you'd never hurt me like that." "Hey!" This time he did take her hand, his thumb wiping away a tear that had fallen on her wrist. "You trusted your friend, which is exactly what Miranda spent months becoming. The person you should have been able to trust was telling you I couldn't be trusted. That's not your fault." The baby-induced hormones weren't helping her emotional state. More tears fell as she remembered the evidence Miranda had presented. The careful way she'd built up to each revelation, the sympathetic shoulder she'd offered while systematically destroying Romley's marriage. "I was so certain," she whispered. "The messages seemed so real. The photos were doctored by an expert." His grip on her hand tightened. "I tried to tell you, tried to prove it, but Miranda had thought of everything. Every time I got close to evidence that would prove my innocence, it disappeared. Now I know why." The diner's usual sounds continued around them. Coffee brewing, plates clinking, the quiet murmur of other customers. But in their booth, time seemed suspended as 18 months of pain and misunderstanding began to heal. "I went back to the hotel," she admitted, "after I found out about the babies. Stood in the lobby trying to decide if I should tell you." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid." Her free hand pressed against her stomach, feeling the slight firmness that was the only sign of the lives growing within. "Afraid you'd think I planned this to trap you. Afraid you'd reject us. Afraid you'd accept us out of obligation." "Obligation?" The word came out sharp with disbelief. "Rome, I've spent 18 months loving you from a distance, trying to prove my innocence, hoping for another chance. These babies aren't an obligation, they're a miracle." Fresh tears spilled at his words. Damn hormones. "Even after everything I put you through." "You put me through?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm the one who let you walk away. Should have followed you, made you listen, found proof sooner." "We both made mistakes." She squeezed his hand. "But Miranda made sure we would. She orchestrated everything, the timing, the evidence, the way it was presented. We never had a chance. Until that night at the harbor view." His eyes darkened with the memory, when truth finally broke through all the lies. The twins chose that moment to make their presence known with a fresh wave of nausea. Romley pressed her free hand to her mouth, fighting it back. "Morning sickness?" His concern was immediate. "What can I do? What do you need?" The caring in his voice nearly undid her. How had she ever doubted this man? "It'll pass. Usually does after a few minutes." "Usually." His eyes narrowed. "How bad has it been? Are you eating enough? Getting enough rest?" "I'm fine." But even as she said it, exhaustion swept over her. The emotional strain of the past 2 weeks, combined with working full shifts at the diner while battling constant nausea, was taking its toll. "No, you're not." He studied her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the slight pallor of her skin. "You're working too hard, probably not eating right because of the nausea and dealing with all this stress alone." Before she could protest, he was sliding out of the booth, pulling her gently with him. "Margot," he called to the older waitress, "she's done for the day." "About time," Margot muttered, already untying Romley's apron. "Been trying to tell her she's pushing too hard." "I'm fine," Romley protested again, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "You're carrying my children," Zale said firmly. "Our children. You need rest, proper food, and someone to take care of you for a change." The possessive note in his voice, the protective way his hand rested on her lower back, it was all so familiar, so right. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd married, the man who'd never stopped loving her even when she'd stopped believing in him. "Let me take you home," he said softly. "We have so much to talk about, so much to figure out. But right now, you need to rest." She looked up at him. This man who'd been her everything, who'd lost everything because of someone else's ambition, who was now offering her everything again. The father of her children, the keeper of her heart, even when she tried to deny it. "Okay," she whispered, and felt him relax slightly beside her. "Take me home." Neither of them specified which home, her tiny apartment or their old house that he'd never sold. Maybe it didn't matter. Home, they were both realizing, wasn't a place at all. It was the truth, finally set free. It was second chances born from first loves. It was two hearts finding their way back to each other, and two tiny lives binding them together in ways no lie could ever tear apart. Chapter 8. Rebuilding. "Move in with me," Zale pleaded outside her apartment a week after the diner confrontation. The evening air was thick with summer heat, cicadas providing a symphony in the background. "Not for the babies, for us. Let me prove everything." Romley stood in her doorway, one hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach. At 10 weeks, the twins were making their presence known through more than just morning sickness. Her apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in with memories and possibilities. He looked exhausted, his suit wrinkled from a long day in court. But his eyes were alert, focused entirely on her. He'd been like this all week, calling to check on her between meetings, bringing her ginger tea and crackers at the diner, watching her with a mixture of love and worry that made her heart ache. "It's not that simple," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "We can't just pick up where we left off." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it hurt. "But we can't keep living like this either. You working doubles at the diner, making yourself sick with exhaustion. Me sitting in our empty house, wondering if you're taking care of yourself, if the babies are okay." Our empty house. The words hit her like a physical blow. "You kept it? All this time? Couldn't sell it?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn since they first met. "Every room holds memories of us. The kitchen where you'd dance while making breakfast. The study where you'd quiz me on case law. The nursery we talked about making someday." His voice cracked on the last word, and she knew he was thinking of the twins growing inside her. Their someday had arrived in the most unexpected way. "I can't trust myself around you," she admitted, voicing her deepest fear. "Every time I look at you, I see both the man who I thought betrayed me and the man I never stopped loving." "Then let's start over." A hint of his old smile appeared, the one that had first captured her heart 5 years ago. "Hi, I'm Zale Dawson, and I've spent the last 18 months taking cases I hate because the office faces this diner." Despite herself, she laughed. "You didn't." "I did. Ask anyone at the firm. Fought for every case in the downtown courthouse just for the chance to drive past Angelo's." His expression softened. "Just to feel close to you somehow." The admission hit her hard. While she'd been rebuilding her life, trying to forget him, he'd been orchestrating his entire career around the slim chance of seeing her. "Miranda told me," she said quietly, "about the private investigator. The attempts to prove the messages were fake. She said you nearly got disbarred trying to subpoena phone records." "Worth it?" His hand reached for hers, fingers intertwining naturally. "Would have been worth anything to prove I never betrayed you." A kick from one of the twins, the first definitive movement she'd felt, made her gasp. Without thinking, she pressed his hand to the spot. "Was that?" His eyes widened in wonder. "They know their father's voice," she whispered, then caught herself. They were supposed to be taking things slow, starting over, but her body remembered him, their babies recognized him, and her heart had never truly forgotten him. "Come home," he said again, his hand still on her stomach. "Not to pick up where we left off, but to start something new, something better." She looked past him at the parking lot of her apartment complex. The cracked concrete, the flickering security lights, the distant sound of sirens. This wasn't the place to bring their children into the world, but more than that, it wasn't the place to rebuild their love. "The nursery needs painting," she found herself saying, "and I'm not supposed to be around paint fumes." His smile could have lit up the entire complex. "I'll hire professionals, any color you want. The kitchen probably needs restocking. I remember how you are about groceries. Already done. He looked slightly sheepish. I might have been hoping you'd say yes. The fridge is full of your favorites, and ginger ale for the morning sickness. My lease ... I'll take care of it. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. Let me take care of everything. You've been so strong for so long, Rome. Let me be strong for you now. Tears threatened. Damn pregnancy hormones. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of you, but of us. Of trying again and failing again. We didn't fail. His thumb wiped away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. We were sabotaged. But now we know the truth. Now we can build something stronger, something based on that truth. A memory flashed through her mind. Their first night in that house, barely unpacked boxes everywhere, dancing in the empty living room to music only they could hear. They'd been so young, so sure of their love, so unaware of how fragile happiness could be. We'll need a bigger car, she said, her hand joining his on her stomach. For the twins. Already researching SUVs. His smile widened. With the highest safety ratings, of course. Of course, she couldn't help but smile back. Some things never changed. His need to protect her, to plan for every contingency, to make sure their life was perfectly arranged. And I'm not quitting my job, she added firmly. At least not yet. We need to see how this goes. Counter offer, he said, slipping easily into lawyer mode. Part-time at the diner, focusing on your nursing classes. You're already halfway through the program. She blinked in surprise. You knew about that. Margot might have mentioned it. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I may have been keeping tabs on you through her, making sure you were okay. Another kick from the twins, as if they were voting on the decision. Romley looked up at the man she'd loved, lost, and found again. The father of her children, the keeper of her heart, even when she'd tried to deny it. One condition, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anything. We take it slow, really slow. Date nights and conversations and rebuilding trust before we jump back into everything. Counter offer, he said again, but his smile was tender. We take it slow, but you still come home. Separate rooms if you want. But let me be there for every moment of this pregnancy. Let me prove with actions, not just words, that I never stopped loving you. She looked back at her apartment, the temporary shelter she'd built when her world fell apart. It had served its purpose, given her space to heal, to grow, to find herself again. But maybe it was time for something more. The nursery should be yellow, she said softly. Neutral, since we don't know the genders yet. His smile could have powered the entire city. Yellow it is. And the kitchen. Needs a new coffee maker, but not for me. No coffee until after the babies come. Already ordered a tea kettle and stocked your favorite herbal blends. She laughed despite herself. You really were planning this. Planning, hoping, praying. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. Coming up with every possible argument to convince you to come home. To give us another chance. We'll need to take my plants, she said, her final token resistance crumbling. They're the only things in there that really matter. I'll get boxes. He was already reaching for his phone. And movers. You shouldn't be lifting anything in your condition. Zale. She caught his hand before he could make the call. I never stopped loving you either. The kiss was gentle, tentative. Not the passionate reunion of that night at the Harbor View, but something deeper. A promise, a beginning, a foundation for rebuilding. When they finally parted, he rested one hand on her stomach, the other still holding hers. So is that a yes? You'll come home? She looked up at him. This man who'd never given up on them, who'd fought for her even when she wouldn't let him, who was now offering her everything she'd been afraid to want again. Yes, she whispered. Let's go home. The cicadas sang their approval as he helped her down the stairs, one arm protectively around her waist. They had so much to rebuild, so much trust to restore, so many conversations ahead. But they had something now they didn't have 18 months ago: truth, understanding, and two tiny lives binding them together in ways no lie could ever tear apart. As they drove toward their home, their real home, Romley watched the city lights blur past. Each mile took them further from the pain of the past and closer to the future they'd always dreamed of. It wouldn't be easy, this rebuilding, but the foundation was solid this time, built on truth instead of lies, on understanding instead of suspicion. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, between one streetlight and another, she realized she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 9. Labor of love. Complications arose in the 7th month. The doctor's words fell like bombs in the sterile examination room. Elevated blood pressure, signs of preeclampsia, need to monitor closely. Romley sat on the examination table, her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly, while Zale gripped her other hand so tightly his knuckles went white. "Bed rest," Dr. Martinez said firmly, her dark eyes serious behind stylish frames. "Complete bed rest until delivery. These twins aren't giving you an easy time, Mrs. Dawson." The name slipped out naturally. They hadn't remarried, were still technically taking things slow, but somehow everyone assumed. Maybe it was the way Zale hadn't missed a single appointment, the way he hovered protectively, the way they still moved in sync, despite everything. "But my job," Romley protested weakly. "My classes." "Can wait," Zale cut in, his voice brooking no argument. The past 2 months of living together had rebuilt more than just their relationship. His protective instincts were stronger than ever. "Nothing is more important than keeping you and our children safe." The drive home was tense with unspoken fears. The twins moved restlessly, as if sensing their mother's distress. Romley watched the familiar streets pass by, remembering other drives, coming home from their wedding, moving into their house for the first time, leaving 18 months ago with a broken heart. Now they were making new memories in those same places. The nursery was finished, painted a soft yellow with white trim. 2 cribs waited for their occupants, assembled by Zale over a weekend, while she supervised from a comfortable chair, remembering how they'd once talked about doing this very thing. "I'll move into your spare room," he said, as they pulled into the driveway. When she looked at him in confusion, he clarified, "To help take care of you. You shouldn't be alone, especially now." Zale. They'd been so careful about boundaries, about taking things slow. He'd kept to the guest room down the hall, giving her space to heal, to trust again. "I lost you once because I didn't fight hard enough," he said, his voice rough with emotion. His hand came to rest on her stomach, feeling the twins kick in response to his touch. "I'm not making that mistake again." The next few days were a whirlwind of arrangements. Zale worked from home, setting up his laptop in her room, taking calls between bringing her meals and checking her blood pressure. Her professors agreed to let her complete the semester remotely, understanding the situation. "I don't need constant supervision," she protested one morning, watching him juggle a conference call while adjusting her pillows. "You have cases to handle, clients who need you. My family needs me more." The words were simple but profound, reminding her of the man she'd first fallen in love with, the one who always put people above profit. She knew he was thinking of Miranda, of how ambition had destroyed their happiness once before. But this was different. This was Zale choosing them, choosing family over career advancement, making his priorities clear. The days blended together, marked by doctor's appointments and prenatal checkups. Zale was there for every moment, learning medical terms with the same intensity he usually reserved for legal precedents. He tracked her blood pressure, monitored her diet, and somehow still managed to win cases from his makeshift office in her bedroom. "The partners are impressed," he told her one evening, bringing her the special tea that helped with swelling. "Said working remotely has actually improved my case preparation. Apparently, I'm more focused." "Because you're not spending all day staring at the diner across the street," she teased, accepting the tea with a grateful smile. His answering laugh held a touch of sheepishness. "Guilty as charged, though I miss seeing you in that uniform." The comment might have once sparked painful memories of other uniforms, other diners, 18 months of separation. But now it just reminded her of how far they'd come, how much they'd rebuilt. The twins grew stronger despite the complications, their kicks and movements a constant reminder of the miracle growing inside her. Zale spent hours talking to them, reading case briefs aloud when he ran out of stories, his voice a soothing backdrop to her mandated rest. "They're going to be lawyers," she joked one afternoon, watching him explain tort reform to her belly. "God forbid," he replied with a grin. "One lawyer in the family is enough. They can be anything they want, doctors, artists, musicians, as long as they're healthy and happy." The simple statement wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. This was what she'd missed most during their separation, not the grand gestures or passionate declarations, but these quiet moments of shared dreams and simple love. Complications arose again in the 8th month. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously during a routine checkup, earning her a 3-day hospital stay. Zale never left her side, working from a chair beside her bed, his presence a constant anchor in the sterile hospital room. "I'm sorry," she whispered one night, watching him type one-handed because his other hand was holding hers. "For doubting you back then, for not letting you explain." He set aside his laptop, giving her his full attention. "We've been through this, Rome. Miranda spent months planning everything, studying exactly how to break us apart. The fault lies with her, not you." "But I should have known." Pregnancy hormones made the old guilt resurface. "Should have trusted what we had." "Hey." He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, careful of the monitoring equipment. "We can't change the past, but look what we're building now. A stronger foundation, complete honesty, 2 beautiful babies on the way." As if on cue, one of the twins kicked strongly enough to visibly move her hospital gown. Zale's hand immediately went to the spot, his face lighting up with the same wonder it had shown at every ultrasound, every movement, every milestone. "I never stopped loving you," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "Even when you left, even when you wouldn't let me explain, even when it seemed hopeless, I knew what we had was real. I never stopped either." The admission came easily now, months of rebuilding trust, making it possible to be vulnerable again. "Even when I thought, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming, my heart never believed what my eyes were seeing." He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. They'd been careful with physical affection, taking things slow as promised. But moments like this, tender, unplanned, natural, were becoming more frequent. "Get some rest," he murmured, but didn't move away. "The twins need their mother strong. And their father needs to actually sleep in a real bed," she countered, eyeing the uncomfortable hospital chair he'd been calling home. "Go home, Zale. Just for tonight." "Not a chance." His smile was tired but determined. "I told you, I'm not making the same mistakes again. Where you go, I go." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. They'd been taking things slow, rebuilding trust day by day, but moments like this made it clear their hearts had never really separated, even when circumstances had torn them apart. She fell asleep to the sound of his typing, the gentle click of keys, a lullaby that reminded her of late nights studying together. of shared dreams and parallel ambitions. Now those dreams were changing, expanding to include two tiny lives and a future that looked nothing like what they'd planned, but somehow felt even more right. The next morning, Dr. Martinez declared her stable enough to return home, but with even stricter bed rest orders. Zale took notes like a star pupil, asking questions about warning signs and emergency procedures. "You've got a good one there," the nurse commented while helping Romley into the wheelchair for discharge. "Some men run when things get complicated. He just digs in deeper." Looking at Zale as he argued with the parking attendant over the best route to bring the car around, wanting to minimize her time in the chair, Romley felt a surge of love, so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly, watching the man who'd never stopped fighting for them, who was now fighting for their growing family with the same dedication. "I really do." Chapter 10. New Beginnings. The twins arrived early, Aria and August, perfect and loud, announcing their presence to the world with powerful lungs they'd clearly inherited from their father's courtroom voice. Romley lay exhausted but triumphant in the hospital bed, watching Zale hold their children for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "They're beautiful," he whispered, cradling them with a gentleness that made her heart ache. Perfect, just like their mother. The labor had been difficult, 36 hours of complications that had tested them both. Zale hadn't left her side once, letting her crush his hand through contractions, advocating fiercely with doctors when her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, being her rock when fear threatened to overwhelm her. Now, watching him with their children, Romley felt the last pieces of her heart healing. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd married, the man who'd never stopped fighting for them even when she'd stopped believing. And he was the father of her children, a role he'd embraced with the same intensity he brought to everything that mattered. "Aria Grace," he murmured to the slightly larger twin, her dark curls already visible. "And August James." The boy was smaller but fiercer, his tiny fists waving in protest at being separated from his sister. They'd chosen the names together during those long weeks of bed rest, rebuilding their connection through shared dreams and quiet conversations. Aria for the music they'd danced to in their kitchen, Grace for the second chance they'd been given, August for the month they'd first met, James not for Miranda's co-conspirator, but for Romley's father, who'd never gotten to meet his grandchildren. "They look like you," Romley said softly, reaching out to touch August's tiny hand. His fingers immediately wrapped around hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "Aria has your eyes," Zale countered, carefully transferring their daughter to Romley's arms. "And your spirit. Did you feel how she fought coming out, already knows her own mind?" The baby settled against her chest, dark eyes blinking up at her mother with an intensity that did indeed mirror Romley's own determined gaze. August, still in his father's arms, began to fuss until Zale brought him closer, letting the twins sense each other's presence. "They don't like being separated," the nurse had noted earlier, typical with twins. "They've spent 9 months together. They need time to adjust to being individuals." Romley understood that feeling of separation all too well. 18 months apart from Zale had taught her how it felt to be divided from part of yourself. But now, watching him with their son while their daughter nestled against her heart, she felt whole in a way she hadn't since before Miranda's lies tore them apart. "I never thought we'd have this," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything, I'd given up on our dream of a family. I never did." Zale sat carefully on the edge of her bed, arranging August so both twins could see each other. "Even during the worst times, I kept imagining our future, our children, our life together. Even when I wouldn't let you explain, when I believed the worst, even then." His free hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. "Because I knew the truth would come out eventually. I just had to be patient, had to keep fighting." Arya made a small sound, almost like a question, and August immediately responded with a similar noise. Their connection was already evident, their bond formed in the safety of the womb, now manifesting in the outside world. "They're teaching us," Zale said softly, watching their interaction. "About unconditional love, about fighting for what matters, about trusting what you know in your heart." The words hit home, making fresh tears spring to Romley's eyes. How many times in the past months had she marveled at his capacity for forgiveness, at his ability to move forward without bitterness, to rebuild their relationship with patience and understanding. "I was so scared," she confessed, remembering those first weeks after discovering her pregnancy. "Scared you'd reject us, scared you'd accept us out of obligation, scared of trusting my heart again." "Never an obligation." He leaned forward carefully, mindful of the babies between them, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "A gift, a miracle, a second chance I didn't think I'd get." August chose that moment to make his hunger known, his cry startling his sister into joining the chorus. The nurse had warned them about this too. When one twin needed something, the other often responded in solidarity. Watching Zale help her position both babies for feeding, his hands steady and sure despite his obvious exhaustion, Romley felt overwhelmed by love for this man who'd never given up on them, who'd fought through lies and manipulation, through separation and pain, through complicated pregnancies and difficult labors, always putting her and their children first. "Marry me again," he whispered once the twins were settled, nursing contentedly. "Not for them, for us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. They'd been taking things slow, rebuilding trust day by day, focusing on the pregnancy and their growing connection. Marriage hadn't been discussed, hadn't seemed necessary when they were already sharing a home and building a family. "We haven't even gone on a real date yet," she laughed through sudden tears. "Then let's start there." His smile was both tender and determined. "Let me court you properly this time. No rushed proposals in diners, no pressure from work or society. Just us, finding our way back to each other while these two keep us honest." Arya unlatched just long enough to make a sound that might have been agreement before returning to her meal. August, not to be outdone, kicked his tiny feet against Romley's arm. "They're voting yes," Zale teased, but his eyes were serious. "What do you say, Rome? Will you let me prove every day for the rest of our lives that what we have is stronger than any lie, any misunderstanding, any outside force that tries to tear us apart?" Looking at him, this man who'd been her first love, her greatest heartbreak, and now her strongest support, Romley felt the last of her walls crumble. "Yes," she whispered, and watched his face light up with the same joy she'd seen when the twins were born. "But I have conditions." "Name them." He was already in lawyer mode, ready to negotiate anything for their happiness. "We start with dates. Real ones, not just takeout between feedings and diaper changes." "Done. I already have reservations at Angelo's diner." She couldn't help but laugh. "The diner? Really? Where else?" His smile was both nostalgic and hopeful. "It's where we began, where we found each other again. Seems right to start our new beginning there too." The twins finished nursing simultaneously, as if coordinating their schedule already. Zale helped her burp them, his hands sure and gentle as they worked together to settle their children. Looking at him, at their babies, at the life they were rebuilding, Romley felt peace settle over her. The past couldn't be changed, but it had led them here, stronger, wiser, more appreciative of the love they shared. "Okay," she said softly. "Angelo's it is." His smile could have lit up the entire hospital. "I love you," he said simply. "All three of you. more than any words could express. Arya and August, as if understanding the importance of the moment, chose that time to fall asleep, their tiny hands finding each other across their parents' arms. Together again, as they were meant to be, just like their parents. Chapter 11. The second first date. Remember our actual first date? Zale asked, leading Romley into Angelo's diner 3 weeks after the twins' birth. The familiar neon lights cast their warm glow over the parking lot, but something was different tonight. The windows were dark, the closed sign prominently displayed. "You spilled coffee on my case files." Romley smiled, then gasped as he opened the door. The interior had been transformed. The usual fluorescent lights were dimmed, replaced by soft candlelight. White tablecloths covered the familiar formica surfaces, and their old booth, the one where everything had begun, was set with fine china and roses. "You still tip me $50, she whispered, taking in the romantic setting. "Even after I ruined your briefs for the Thompson case. Best investment I ever made." He guided her to their booth, pulling out the chair that had been placed at the table instead of the usual vinyl seating. "Though technically, you didn't ruin anything. Won that case with the coffee-stained documents. The judge found it endearing." Margot appeared from the kitchen, wearing a crisp white shirt instead of her usual uniform. "Welcome back," she said warmly, setting down 2 coffee cups. "Though I hear it's sparkling cider tonight instead of coffee, since you're still nursing." Romley touched the cups, recognizing them instantly. "These are the same ones from our first date," Zale confirmed. "Margot saved them all this time." The older waitress winked. "Knew you kids would find your way back to each other eventually. Just had to be patient." As she disappeared back into the kitchen, Romley took in more details of the carefully planned evening. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, the same playlist they danced to in their kitchen countless times. The roses on the table were yellow and white, just like their wedding bouquet. "The twins?" she asked, though she already knew they were well cared for. "With your sister," Zale assured her. "She practically had to push us out the door, said we needed this time for ourselves. We've never been apart from them before." 3 weeks of constant togetherness made even this short separation feel strange. "I know." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I've already checked my phone twice since we left the house, but they're fine, and we need this. Need to remember how to be us, not just parents." The sound of their baby's cries still echoed in her memory, but he was right. They needed this time to reconnect, to continue rebuilding what had been broken. "How did you arrange all this?" she asked, gesturing at the transformed diner. "Margot's idea, actually. Said she was tired of watching us dance around each other all those months." His thumb traced patterns on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "She remembered every detail of our first date, right down to what we ordered." On cue, Margot reappeared with their plates. Grilled cheese with tomato for her, club sandwich for him. Simple diner food served on fine china, somehow perfect for this moment of past meeting present. "I remember sitting here that first night," Romley said softly, "watching you try to salvage those coffee-stained papers. You were so focused, so dedicated. It was the first thing that attracted me to you, how much you cared about doing things right." "And I remember looking up to see you watching me," he replied. "The way you bit your lip when you were worried, how your eyes lit up when I made that joke about the judge. I fell a little bit in love with you right then." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with everything they'd been through since that first meeting. The whirlwind romance, the perfect wedding, the devastating separation, and now this careful rebuilding with 2 precious lives depending on them. "When did you know?" she asked, the question she'd never dared voice before. "That night, at the Harbor View, when did you know we still had a chance?" He considered for a moment, his hand still holding hers. The moment you kissed me. Not because of the passion or the reconciliation that followed, but because of how you kissed me. Like you'd been holding back for 18 months, like your body remembered what your mind wasn't ready to accept. Heat flooded her cheeks at the memory. That kiss had changed everything, had created the two miracles currently being spoiled by their aunt across town. For me, it was earlier, she admitted, when you first walked into the diner that night, drunk and hurt, and still looking at me like I was the answer to every question you'd ever had. Even after everything, you still looked at me that way. I never stopped. His voice was rough with emotion. Even when you wouldn't let me explain, wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't believe in us. I never stopped looking at you that way, because I knew what we had was real, knew the truth would come out eventually. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words familiar now but still necessary. For doubting you, for letting Miranda manipulate me, Hey. He squeezed her hand gently. We've been through this. Miranda spent months planning everything, studying exactly how to break us apart. The fault lies with her, not you. Still. She looked down at their joined hands, at the empty spaces where their wedding rings had once been. I should have trusted what we had. We both should have done things differently. His free hand came up to tilt her chin, making her meet his eyes. But look what we have now. Two beautiful children, a stronger foundation than ever before, and a second chance to do things right. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a photo from her sister. The twins, sleeping peacefully, tiny hands clasped together even in slumber. They're already better at this than we are. She laughed softly, showing him the picture. Look how they hold on to each other, trust each other completely. They're teaching us, he agreed, smiling at their children's instinctive bond, about unconditional love, about fighting for what matters, about trusting your heart. Margot appeared again, this time with dessert, apple pie a la mode, just like their first date. But instead of the diner's usual plates, these slices were served on delicate china with an intricate pattern that made Romley's breath catch. Our wedding china, she whispered, recognizing the design she'd spent months choosing. How did you... Never got rid of it? He looked slightly sheepish. Kept everything from our life together, hoping someday... The admission brought fresh tears to her eyes. Damn postpartum hormones making her emotional. Or maybe it was just him, this man who'd never stopped believing in them, even when she had. Dance with me? He asked suddenly, standing and holding out his hand. The soft jazz had shifted to a familiar melody, their wedding song. Here? Now? Why not? We've danced in this diner before. She took his hand, letting him pull her into his arms. They swayed together between the tables, her head finding its natural place on his shoulder, his cheek resting against her hair. I miss this, she murmured, dancing with you in random places, not caring who might see. We can have it again. His arms tightened slightly around her waist. All of it, the spontaneous dances, the quiet moments, the crazy adventures, plus two amazing additions who already have me wrapped around their tiny fingers. She laughed softly, remembering how he'd spent an hour that morning just watching the twins sleep, completely enchanted by their every movement. They look like you when they're concentrating, she said. That little furrow between their brows, the way they purse their lips. But they have your determination. Did you see August yesterday, refusing to let go of that rattle? And Aria with her opinions about which lullaby she wants? They continued dancing, trading observations about their children, marveling at how two tiny beings could be so perfectly a blend of them both. Stay with me tonight, he whispered as the song ended. Not in the guest room, not because of the twins needing care. Stay with me because you want to, because we're ready to take that step. She pulled back slightly to look at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his quiet confidence. They'd been sharing a house but keeping careful distance, focusing on the twins and their gradual reconciliation. "Are we?" she asked softly. "Ready?" "I think we've been ready since that night at the harbor view." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "We just needed time to prove it to ourselves." Looking into his eyes, the same eyes that had captured her heart 5 years ago, that had haunted her dreams during their separation, that now looked at her with such love and hope, Romilly felt the last of her reservations melt away. "Yes," she whispered, and watched his face light up with joy. "But we need to get home to the twins first." "Already planned for?" He grinned, pulling out his phone to show a message from her sister. "They're staying with their aunt tonight. She insisted we take our time remembering how to be us." "Sneaky," she accused, but couldn't help smiling. "You had this all arranged?" "Hoped," he corrected. "I've learned not to take anything for granted. Every moment with you, with our children, is a gift I thought I'd lost forever." The simple honesty of his words touched her heart. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, passionate but patient, determined but gentle, always putting their happiness first. "Take me home," she said softly, and watched his eyes darken with remembered passion and new promise. As they left the diner, Margot's knowing smile following them out, Romilly felt peace settle over her. They'd begun here years ago, found each other again in this same space, and now were starting a new chapter surrounded by memories and possibilities. The neon lights cast their familiar glow as they walked to the car, hand in hand. But this time, instead of goodbye, they spelled out hello, to second chances, to renewed love, to a future brighter than any they'd imagined before. Chapter 12. Full circle. Their second wedding was nothing like their first. No grand church, no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations. Just them, their 6-month-old twins, and their closest family gathered at Angelo's diner, where it all began. The familiar neon lights cast a warm glow through windows, now adorned with fairy lights. White roses and baby's breath transformed the vintage booths into something magical. Aria and August, dressed in matching white outfits, sat contentedly in their grandmother's arms, somehow understanding the importance of the moment. Romilly wore a simple cream dress that flowed around her curves, her short curls adorned with tiny flowers. Zale couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the makeshift aisle between the diner's tables, carrying a bouquet of yellow roses. The same colors from their first wedding, but this time with 2 tiny rosebuds representing their children. Margot had outdone herself transforming the diner. Their old booth, where Zale had first proposed years ago, now held the wedding cake. The counter where they'd first met was decorated with photos telling their story, from that first coffee-stained encounter through the twins' birth, documenting every step of their journey back to each other. "I have a confession," Zale said during their first dance, holding her close as their favorite jazz song played softly. "I wasn't actually drunk that night at the diner. Well, maybe a little, but I knew exactly what I was doing." Romilly looked up at him, remembering that pivotal night when he'd returned to her life. "What do you mean?" "I'd seen you working there weeks before," he admitted. "Started taking every case downtown just to drive past. That night, I finally worked up the courage to come in. The drinks with colleagues were just for show." "I know." Her smile was both tender and amused. "Your coffee cup was full of water after the first hour. I was your waitress, remember?" He laughed, pulling her closer. "Always one step ahead of me." "Not always," she murmured, watching their twins now dozing in their matching carriers. "But we got here eventually." The diner's regulars had insisted on attending, creating an atmosphere of community and celebration. Even some of Zale's colleagues came, those who had stood by him during the separation and supported their reconciliation. Miranda's absence was notable, but necessary. Her disbarment had been finalized, her manipulation exposed. But in an odd way, they had her to thank for this stronger version of their love, one tested by fire, proven unbreakable. "We've wasted enough time," Zale whispered as they swayed to the music. "No more mistakes." "No," she agreed, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of promise and forever. "Just second chances." The twins chose that moment to wake, demanding attention in perfect synchronization. Romley moved to get them, but their grandmother was already there, expertly soothing them back to sleep. "They're giving us this moment," Zale smiled, drawing her back into his arms. "Smart kids." "Like their father," she teased. "Strong, like their mother," he countered, his voice softening. "Beautiful and determined and absolutely perfect." The fairy lights twinkled above them, creating a magical atmosphere in the familiar space. Their wedding bands, the originals, never truly abandoned, caught the light as they danced, symbols of a love that had endured separation, misunderstanding, and pain to emerge stronger. Later, as they cut their cake, served on the same china plates from their first date, Romley looked around at their gathered loved ones. Her sister holding Arya, his brother entertaining August, Margot watching it all with satisfied pride. This was family, built not just of blood but of choice and circumstance and unwavering love. "Happy?" Zale asked softly, his arm around her waist. "Perfect," she replied, leaning into him, "though I do have one more surprise." His eyebrows rose as she guided his hand to her stomach, still flat but holding a new secret. His eyes widened with understanding, just as Arya and August let out simultaneous happy squeals, as if approving the news of their future sibling. "Really?" His voice cracked with emotion. "Really?" she confirmed. "Apparently that night after our first real date back here." His kiss cut off her words, drawing cheers and whistles from their guests. When they parted, his eyes shone with tears of joy. "I love you," he said simply. "All of you, more than I could ever express." "Show me," she whispered. "We have the rest of our lives." The diner's neon lights painted their world in shades of possibility as they danced again, surrounded by family and love. Their journey had begun here between coffee cups and case files, had weathered storms of separation and misconception, and now had brought them full circle. But this wasn't an ending. This was a new beginning, written in the sleepy smiles of their twins, in the subtle swell of coming joy, in the promises they'd made and kept, and would keep making every day forward. As night fell outside Angelo's diner, casting the familiar streets in darkness, the light inside grew stronger. It shone in Zale's eyes as he held his family close, in Romley's smile as she watched their children charm their guests, in the simple gold bands that marked not just a marriage, but a triumph of love over lies, of truth over deception, of hope over hurt. They had come home, not to a place, but to each other. And this time, they were here to stay. Subscribe if you loved.